In this video for Nikon Zf and Zfc photographers, we're going to look at some tips for using auto ISO, which I think is an incredibly valuable feature to be familiar with and know how to use. If you're not familiar with auto ISO and the benefits that it can give you as a photographer, I did cover all of that in an older video. And keep in mind, when I say an older video, it is an older video. But you can go back and watch that. It'll be linked in the video description here, just to get an understanding of what auto ISO is and how it can benefit us as photographers. So after you're kind of familiar with that, now I want to go over a setup of auto ISO in the Nikon ZF and the ZFC. So first of all, for setting it up, you're going to go into the photo shooting menu and then ISO sensitivity setting. In that menu, you're going to see a number on the top. And that number simply reflects what your ISO dial on the top of the camera is set to. That number is going to be the minimum ISO that your camera is going to use when auto ISO is enabled. When auto ISO is disabled, that's just going to show you which ISO you're currently using. But when auto ISO is on, that is going to be your minimum ISO. And I think that's important to point out because if you're using a high ISO, like 1600, and then you turn auto ISO on, your minimum is going to be 1600 if that's where the dial is set. So be aware of that. And if you do turn auto ISO on, make sure that most people are probably going to want to set 100 for the minimum ISO. But then you're going to see two other settings. Your maximum ISO for when you're not using flash and your maximum ISO for when you are using flash. Now, photographers are going to set different things for this number. It's just all dependent on the limit that you are comfortable giving the camera permission to operate to for the maximum ISO when it's in auto. Like how high do you feel comfortable giving the camera permission to go? For me, 6400. I'm perfectly fine letting the camera go up to ISO 6400 if that's where it needs to be. So that's what I set for both without a flash and with a flash. You're also going to see the minimum shutter speed. And this is the minimum shutter speed the camera is going to go to before it starts raising that ISO, the slowest shutter speed. This too is also going to vary from photographer to photographer. If you're photographing still life and you're on a tripod, you can go down to whatever limits you need for exposure to get a proper exposure. If you're photographing people on the street, maybe you want 1/250th of a second for your slowest shutter speed. If you're photographing sports, depending on the sport, you may need 1/1000th of a second. So you can set that there, and then the camera is going to slow to that shutter speed before it raises the ISO to your maximum. But what you'll also see in here, and what I think can confuse a lot of people, is auto, which is going to base the minimum shutter speed on the current focal length. It's going to more or less follow the inverse focal length rule, meaning that if you're using a 50mm lens, the slowest shutter speed is going to be 1/50th of a second. So that's what auto is. But then you'll see slower and faster, -2 to +2. And this is what can confuse a lot of people is what do those numbers mean? Well, that's in relation to the number of stops slower or faster than that inverse focal length rule. So if you have auto set and you're using a 50mm lens, like I said, auto is going to set 1/50th of a second for the minimum shutter speed. But if you set one stop slower, the camera is going to slow the minimum shutter speed one stop from that inverse focal length rule. And for 1/50th of a second, one stop slower is 1/25th of a second. If you set it slower 2 stops, that's going to slow the minimum shutter speed 2 stops from 1/50th of a second, which would be approximately 1/13th of a second. Faster, one stop faster from 1/50th is 1/100th of a second, and then faster +2 would be 1/200th of a second. Now, if you're photographing still life on a tripod, you probably want auto for the shutter speed to get that inverse focal length rule, but you can slow that down. Set it to slow -1, slow -2, if it is indeed still life and you're on a tripod, and that'll help you get or use lower ISOs. So that's what that minimum shutter speed does. On the Nikon ZF, you do have one other setting on that ISO dial, and that's C. If it's set to C, that means you'll use other methods of changing your ISO and enabling auto ISO. You can use the touchscreen, just tap on ISO there. You can also use a custom control. If you have one of the custom controls in the custom setting F2 menu set to ISO, you'll push that control and then use the sub command dial, the front command dial, to enable or disable auto ISO, and then use the main command dial, the rear command dial, to change your ISO, which includes your minimum ISO. When you are using auto ISO, you'll see auto ISO on the bottom of the display, and then the number that you have next to that will be the camera's calculated ISO value, dependent on all of your other exposure settings for whatever exposure mode you're in. That's going to be the ISO the camera is going to use in auto at that instant in time. And then one other thing to note in playback mode, if you do have auto ISO enabled for any photo, your ISO is going to be in red in playback. That's what that means if you see that in red. You did use auto ISO. Now let's go over some tips on using auto ISO. And the first is increasing your maximum ISO on the fly. Let's just look at my example where I have 6,400 set as my maximum ISO. Well, if I'm photographing in low light, the camera is never going to go above 6,400. What it will do, however, is go below my programmed minimum shutter speed, which might give me a shutter speed that's too slow. I might get blurry images. 6,400 isn't high enough in that low light, so how do I increase that without having to reprogram it in the menu? Well, the quickest way to do that is to just rotate the ISO dial on the top of the camera to something higher than your maximum. Remember that that ISO dial sets your minimum auto ISO. So if your minimum is 100, your maximum is 6,400, but you need to instantly set a maximum of 12,800, you just rotate the dial to 12,800, and now the camera is going to use 12,800 as the maximum, since that's the new minimum, right? And that'll give you a faster shutter speed for sharper photos. The other little tip that I want to point out is how to change your minimum shutter speed on the fly. So let's say you're doing still life, you have it set to auto, and it's giving you 1/50th of a second for your minimum shutter speed, and that's what the camera is using. But then you have some movement in your frame, and you need to freeze that movement, and 1/50th of a second just isn't going to do it. Well, you don't want to have to go into the menus and reprogram your minimum shutter speed to something faster, to a speed that will freeze that movement. So all you need to do, and this is assuming that you're using aperture priority mode or program auto, where the camera is picking the shutter speed, all you need to do is flip that mode switch to the M position, and then it's going to use whatever is set on your shutter speed dial. So going back to what I said, typically shoot in aperture priority mode where the camera picks the shutter speed. I still have 250 set on the shutter speed dial. The camera's not using that. It's aperture priority mode. The camera is figuring out the shutter speed. But if I do need a faster shutter speed in an instant, all I need to do is flip that mode switch to M. The camera is going to use 1/250th of a second as my set fixed shutter speed with whatever aperture that I have set, and then use auto ISO using the exposure compensation dial to set how bright or how dark that photo is in manual exposure mode. So that's a neat little tip just to quickly set your minimum shutter speed without having to go into the menus. So I hope those tips helped you figure out how to use auto ISO in the Nikon ZF and ZFC It's a great tool to use to make sure that you're getting sharper photos. If you have any other comments, questions, or tricks about auto ISO, please leave them in the comments here, and we'll see you in the next video.